I'm telling this story on behalf of my departed grandmother. Truth is oftentimes stranger than fiction. This story has been passed down through our family for years, and it served as a reminder that you can never be too careful. I don't know the exact year this happened, but this took place during the 1950s, when my grandmother was in her 20s or so. She was living in a very rural area of Kansas at the time. She had already given birth to my mother. However, she claimed to be stepping out on my grandfather with another woman. I have no idea if that's actually true, but I don't see why she would lie about that. On one stormy night, my grandmother left her daughter with her mother and drove out to her girlfriend's house. According to her, the two of them had been planning to get drunk and listen to some records together. She arrived at the dark farmhouse in the pouring rain and knocked on the front door, only to get no response back. Back then, when plans suddenly changed, you wouldn't find out until it was too late most of the time. It's not like you could send a text message or call someone whenever you wanted. Figuring that something had happened and she had to go somewhere, my grandmother decided to spend the night in the empty house anyways, so she didn't have to drive back in the pouring rain. She began to search for a spare key. She went around to the back of the house with the wind tearing at her coat and nearly knocking her over. She reached the back porch and continued to search for the spare key. Apparently, it was not in any of the usual spots. She sat down on the somewhat sheltered back porch behind a pile of firewood. My grandma says that her being too stubborn to just go back home was likely what saved her life that night. She lit up a cigarette and sat there smoking for an uncertain amount of time. She didn't want to break into her girlfriend's house, but she also didn't want to have to go back out in the pouring rain and wind. The bad conditions had only gotten worse, with lightning crisscrossing all across the sky. The wind was so rough that it was even making the wooden fence lean at a sharp angle. That was when she saw a light coming from inside the house. It wasn't the light of a lamp or anything, though. It was a beam of light that flashed quickly. Figuring that her friend had returned home, she stood and pressed her face against the window. She didn't knock or call out because she figured the noise from the storm would just drown her out anyway. She just waited to be spotted by the window. The flashlight disappeared into another room, and after a moment, she caught the sight of a man she didn't know, moving around way too slowly to be someone who knew the layout of the house. She only caught a quick glimpse of him in the darkness, but she knew enough to know that was not a member of her girlfriend's family. She thought it could have been a neighbor she didn't know, but his suspicious behavior was making her uneasy. She ducked down and decided to wait for a while, despite the raging storm. After a long time of hiding crouched beneath the window, she would occasionally see the flashlight beam dance across the back porch from one of the inside windows. She figured if it was someone who was supposed to be there, they would have either turned on a light or at the very least stopped wandering around so sneakily as if looking for something by now. Pretty soon, the back porch door opened, and the stranger stepped outside. He shined the light across the length of the porch, including the wood pile which fortunately prevented her from being seen. She stayed hidden, and after another brief sweep with his light, the person went back inside. He could have easily discovered her had he decided to be more thorough, but she figured he doubted anyone would be hiding there, given how rough the weather was. She heard the door slam again, and the stranger disappeared back inside the house. She peeked in through the window and watched as the man went upstairs. She waited in apprehension until he came back to the ground floor, still carefully shining his flashlight around. He eventually wandered over to the front door. Then she heard it slam shut. Afraid that he may walk around the perimeter and discover her, she emerged from her hiding place and opened the back door, which was now unlocked. She carefully made her way inside and locked the door behind her, not turning on any lights. She then ran to the front door and locked it as well. She looked out into the front yard, but didn't spot the intruder anywhere. Shivering, she locked herself in the downstairs bathroom and covered herself up with towels. She was very aware the man could possibly still be in the house, or even have his own key. After she dried herself off, she risked a quick run up the stairs and locked herself in her friend's bedroom. She tried the light in the bedroom for a split second, just to see if the power was out. It was not. She laid down on the bed and nearly drifted off when a blinding flash came from outside, followed by a thunderous crackling. It really startled her for a moment, but rational thought prevailed. One of the old trees out front must have been struck by lightning. She fell asleep, and the following day she got up and searched the house in daylight. There were still no signs of her girlfriend or her family anywhere. She called her mother and then the police as well. An officer arrived a short while later, and she explained everything that happened the night before. She was unable to get a hold of her friend at all. The officer acknowledged it may have been someone with permission to be in the house, but decided to take a look around anyway. After a while, he called to my grandmother and asked for her to describe what the stranger from the night before had been wearing. She couldn't recall with any real certainty, as it had been pretty dark out. Apparently, a body had been discovered in some of the tall grass of the front yard. My grandmother's girlfriend returned home after the body had been removed from the property. Turns out she had been stranded several towns over because of the road being washed out by the bad storm. The corpse was a man who had been an older friend of the family, but someone who most definitely did not have permission to be in their house alone. What had actually killed him was a bolt of lightning that struck him in the front yard. The man had been carrying a large knife in his hand, which they suspect had attracted the lightning strike. It was suspected the man had come looking for my grandmother's girlfriend, as she had rejected his advances in the past. But when he spotted the strange car in the driveway, he decided to enter the house and find out who was visiting. Now, of course, this is all just a theory, but the family stressed this man would have never been allowed to access the house by himself, and they had nothing of his that he might have been looking for. This happened in 1987, when I was about 15 years old. I used to live in this small town in northern Ohio. Back in those days, I was the neighborhood paper boy for a while. I would deliver the newspapers almost every morning before school. During the summer, I would often ride my bike around to the park or go hang out with my friends down by the lake. The point is, I was often seen on my bike a lot, so it was unfortunate that during one of my paper routes, a reckless driver blindsided me, which resulted in my left thigh being fractured and my bicycle being completely destroyed. It took me 3 months to recover, and by the time I did, the paper had already hired a new delivery boy. I was left without a bike, and on top of all that, they never even caught the guy who ran into me. There's no real nice way to say this, but my parents are neglectful shits. I stopped talking to them years ago. At the time of my injury, they viewed me as more of an inconvenience in their eyes. The local police department wasn't really much better either. It was pretty much run by a single family who had no interest in enforcing the law at all. They seemed to be more concerned with blackmailing prostitutes in exchange for sexual favors. Nobody really gave a rat's ass that some drunk asshole had nearly ended my life, but what could I do about it? I was only 15 years old. I just had to make the best of things and carry on. Shortly after I was released from the hospital, my friend Kyle invited me over to his house, claiming that his parents were out of town on some business. He had discovered a bottle of Jack Daniels that his father had forgotten to lock away in the liquor cabinet. I, of course, obliged. Unfortunately, I had to walk everywhere without a bike. I knew better than to hitchhike in this backwards town, though. By the time it got to Kyle's, it was around 7 p.m., and Kyle was already pissed drunk, with about 90% of the bottle already gone. After about 20 minutes of sitting on his couch and listening to him drivel on about how he wanted to smash the math teacher, Kyle vomited on the living room floor and promptly passed out. Being sober and obviously frustrated, I decided to make the long trek back home in the dark. Getting out of Kyle's neighborhood was simple enough, but there was this long dark stretch of highway that I had to traverse to get back to my place. Making this trip during the day was no big deal at all, but it was quite daunting at nighttime. There are no street lights on this road, so unless the moon was out, it would be nearly pitch black. It was only a half moon that night, so things were a bit obscured, but you could still see enough of your surroundings to make your way. My house was just off the first intersection you came upon. The rest of the way was well lit from there, but it was a good 3-mile hike to get to that intersection. I was about a quarter of the way when I got this inexplicable sensation that I was being followed. I turned around, only to see what appeared to be a dark figure standing in the middle of the road. They were barely visible in the moonlight, and they appeared to just be standing there. I figured it was one of the many drug addicts that lurked around these parts. I quickened my pace and scolded myself for forgetting my pocket knife, which I usually always carried on me for protection. I didn't want to show that I was afraid, so I didn't walk too fast. I also wasn't exactly taking my time either. Another 5 minutes had passed by. I looked behind me again. The dark figure was now on the sidewalk and was noticeably closer to me. I want to point out that as I turned around, the figure was just standing there. It was not apparent that the figure had been running or even walking towards me. It was almost as if every time I would turn around, they would immediately stop and stare at me. Now, obviously, this is not the type of experience you want to have when you're walking home alone in the dark. I wasted no time in speeding towards the intersection. It wasn't until the lights came into view that I heard a sudden pounding behind me. Something inside me told me not to turn around, but I couldn't resist. My worst nightmare was confirmed. I saw the dark figure now barreling towards me. The distance between us was closing quickly, and I could tell there was something in their hands. The way they were holding this object made me conclude it must have been a knife of some sort. I ran as fast as I could, tearing past the intersection and across the road to the entrance of my neighborhood. From the entrance, you could see the intersection clearly. When I turned back for the last time, I could see a deranged-looking man standing under one of the streetlights. He had a massive knife in his right hand. He was about 6 feet tall, with a balding head and a big beard that went down to his stomach. He appeared to be severely out of shape, but someone who could easily overpower a 15-year-old. As I darted down the neighborhood street, I could hear a crazed voice shouting from behind me. "If I ever see you again, I'm gonna cut your head off!" As soon as I got to my house, I slammed the door shut behind me. I nearly passed out from exhaustion and panic. My parents were not home at the time, so I ended up blocking myself in my bedroom and eventually passed out after hours of staring out my bedroom window. I didn't call the cops, mostly because it didn't occur to me in my panicked state of mind, and by the time I could think straight again, I came to the conclusion the corrupted police force would not take my claims seriously anyway. You can pretty much apply the same reasoning as to why I didn't tell my parents. As soon as I turned 18, I left that place behind and never looked back. In some bizarre way, I now view that deranged man in the darkness as a manifestation of everything wrong with that town. I grew up in the village of Dunning, Nebraska, and I have very fond memories of that place. Simply put, as I started getting a bit older, I soon realized there was no future for me there. I enlisted in the military when I was 19. Growing up in Dunning during the 1980s is something I would say was akin to a setting in a Stephen King novel. You had your religious nutjobs, your wisecracking town folk, and an atmosphere of isolation. And that's not to say the town was inherently creepy or anything. It was just the sort that seemed cut off from the rest of the world. Definitely not a place for social media influencers to visit or anything, because if you're not into outdoor activities, you're going to be very bored there. To the east of town is the Nebraska National Forest, which our family would often visit when I was a kid. Being such a close-knit community, I was pretty much friends with all the other kids my age. Something we often enjoyed doing together was going fishing in the nearby rivers. I recall that my school was taking a field trip to the National Forest, and I couldn't attend for some reason or another. I can't seem to remember if it was because of poor grades or bad behavior, probably a mixture of the two to be honest. When I got out of school that day, I was pretty much the only kid left in town. This was one of the rare times where I would go fishing by myself. As soon as I got home that day, I quickly finished my household chores before packing up my fishing gear and setting off on my bike. My friends and I would usually fish in the river because it was very close to town. However, since they weren't with me on that day, I decided to head down to the Dismal River, which ran along the west side of town, before merging with the other one. It was sort of on the outskirts of Dunning. To give you a bit of the lay of the land out there, beyond this river was a no man's land in every sense of the word. Aside from a few residential properties, there was absolutely nothing for miles on end but hills and trees. I spent about 30 minutes casting my line, but I wasn't catching anything, much to my dismay. I relocated my operation a bit upstream, towards where the two rivers intersected. Suddenly, I could feel a dense pressure in the atmosphere. I'm sure most of you can relate. That creepy, unnerving feeling you get when someone is watching you. I did my best to ignore this feeling and continue fishing, but there was something that kept drawing my attention towards one end of the dead trees, situated about 30 feet from the riverbank. The exact year was 1988, when the entire country was experiencing droughts that caused many trees to die off. I began to smell something foul in the air. It was a thick, putrid stench like something had died and been decomposing in the sun all day. Strangely, I did not see a single vulture or scavenger around. Usually, they would be swarming any animal carcasses shortly after they died. Curiosity got the better of me. I set my fishing rod down and went to investigate these weird trees. As I approached, I noticed a hole in the ground, like someone had dug a grave or something and forgotten to throw the dirt back over it. As I got closer, I could feel goosebumps go up and down my arms. Once I got close enough, I peered down into the hole. I'll swear until my dying day that this is what I saw there. There was the body of a young girl laying at the bottom of this hole. I vaguely remember seeing a mangled nightgown wrapped around her body. They appeared to be 12 years old. I didn't scare easily, but this sent me fleeing back to town with tears in my eyes. By the time I arrived back home, my dad was home from work as well. I told him in between my sobs what I had seen out there. My dad was very good friends with one of the deputies at the Blaine County Sheriff's Office. He immediately called him and relayed to him what I had seen by the river. Me and my dad met 3 Blaine County deputies near the spot where I had seen the corpse. They even brought a trained canine along with them, but after hours of combing through the riverbanks, But even after hours of combing through the riverbanks, they could not find a single thing. I was scolded by my father for making up stories, and that I should never waste the police's time. As punishment, I was not allowed to go fishing for months after this incident. That really sucked because there wasn't much else to do around there. Even after all these years, though, I still stand by my story. I saw the body of a young girl lying at the bottom of a hole. I didn't have a wild imagination as a kid, and I may have misbehaved every once in a while, but I would never make up a story about seeing something that awful. The smell, the position of the body, the dirty nightgown. I remember too many details for this to be some kind of imagination. The only thing that I can guess is that either whoever did it returned to take the body away, or the sheriff's office for some reason covered it up. The hills of Nebraska surely have their secrets. This was my darkest call for help before becoming an EMT. I was a team leader for a lifeline service in the UK. These can be linked to smoke alarms as well. A call came through at one point for a smoke alarm activation in a house roughly 5 minutes away from our call center. All I could hear initially was the beeping of the smoke alarm. It was quite distorted because it was so loud. In the background, I could hear a faint but panicked call for help, and what sounded like the service user desperately asking for water. I obviously called the fire service and kept the call open. I listened as this roaring sound gradually got louder and louder, and then I could hear a crackling and popping sound, probably the windows exploding from the heat. I'm not fully sure. I then began to hear the most horrific sounds I've ever heard. I'm not sure how to explain it to do it justice, but it sounded like a man faintly screaming and making gurgling, panicked sounds. After several minutes of listening to this and repeating instructions for him to get outside, I could hear respirators and the beeping of the fire service radios. At this point, I decided to leave the call center to be run by my colleagues and drive out to this house to see what was going on. I thought surely they must have rescued the man, but I was in denial about what I'd actually heard. To my surprise, once I arrived, the fire service told me they hadn't found anyone. About an hour later, I was informed they'd found a body. This man was a wheelchair user. He was found right next to his wheelchair by the back door, locked inside the house. I had to go to a coroner's court to explain my involvement. This is where I learned the man was a smoker who regularly lit his cigarettes with matches. He also used paraffin-based cream for his skin. He'd lit a cigarette and dropped the match under his knees. That accidentally set fire to his own body. The man was so burnt he had to be identified using dental records. The cries for help and the noises of him gurgling and screaming as he burned to death still haunt me to this day. In fact, I'm not even sure if it was him gurgling or his skin bubbling up. I can't get the image of what it must have looked like out of my head. That was about 3 years ago now, but I'll never let myself forget that man. He taught me that you should never get emotionally invested in an incident. I've seen and dealt with equally nasty situations as an EMT, but thanks to this gentleman, I can let go of the emotional baggage that comes with seeing such horrific things. I'm a delivery driver for Amazon. Several months ago, I had a really weird experience. The route I was driving went through mostly one city, and as you know, countless people use Amazon Prime to buy items. I often found myself delivering to a lot of the same houses, time and time again. A lot of them blended together for me because they all looked so similar, but there was one house in particular that I really remembered. It was a pretty average neighborhood. The street was quiet and there were lots of houses on both sides. Most of the houses had about the same size front and back yards. I delivered to one house sort of about halfway down the street, which had 2 floors and this gigantic tree out front. Whenever I delivered a package there, I would walk up a driveway that was in the middle of the front yard, leading to the front step. I would then set down the package on the front step and go back to my truck. I remember one time delivering there. As I was walking up, I saw somebody in the top window. There was a man looking out, just staring at me. It was really creepy because the way he was staring at me was very intense. His eyes were practically bulging out of his head. I saw him walking up and was instantly weirded out by it. After I dropped off the package and walked back, before I got inside my truck, I decided to take another look. He was standing there staring at me. The guy was tall and thin, and that's about all I could really tell. Several days later, I had another delivery to the same address. I only realized that it was the same one when I saw that strange guy again. He was in the same place, looking through the window and staring at me at the very same way. The next day, he had another package. He did the same thing. I thought this guy was quite strange. Then, a few days later, I had another delivery to make there. By now, I knew exactly which house this was. I was already expecting to see the guy staring at me. I looked up to the window, but he actually wasn't there. That was a change of pace. However, as I approached the front door, I saw a piece of paper was taped to it. I started to read it. It said, "Please deliver the package to the back door today. The gate is open." There was an arrow pointing to the left. I thought that was quite weird. I wasn't sure why they wanted the package at the back door. I looked past the weird behavior of the guy. Maybe it was a more valuable item I was delivering this time, or maybe one of the packages had been stolen in the past. I walked to the left and saw that at this property, the entire backyard was all fenced in. The fence wrapped all the way around to connect with the ends of the house. It was also about 7 feet high and made of solid material. You couldn't see inside at all. As I walked through the gate, the backyard was pretty normal looking. Just grass, a few trees and plants scattered around. I walked along the side of the house until I got to the back door. I set the package down on the ground right outside of it. I started heading back for the gate, but once I got there, the gate was now closed. I tried opening it, but I couldn't get it open. It was like somebody had locked it from the outside. I walked to the other side of the house to see if there was another gate. Sadly, there was not. I was walking back to the first one when I saw the man was now standing outside the back door. He was just staring at me. My heart started racing. I wasn't exactly sure what to do. "Hey, I tried going back out that gate, but it won't open." The man didn't say anything. He was not staring at me as intensely as before, but he was sure coming across as very strange. He pointed to his back door, which was wide open. He signaled for me to go inside his house. I didn't really want to, but I also didn't know what else to do. I walked forward and went inside. The man followed me in. When I got inside his house, it was pitch black. Almost every window was covered up. All the lights were off as well. I just walked straight ahead the whole time. I was nervous something was going to happen to me, like the guy was going to whack me in the back of the head or something. I could just barely see, but I did see the front door ahead of me. When I made it there, the man was right on my ass. He didn't say or do anything. I reached for the handle of the front door, afraid it would be locked just like the gate, but to my surprise, it opened right up. I made it outside and was on his front step. I went very quickly back to my truck. When I was almost there, I turned around and looked behind me. The man was still inside the house, standing just inside the door. He was staring at me and smiling the creepiest smile I've ever seen. I got in my truck and drove to my next delivery, trying to calm myself down. When I made it back that day, I begged my boss to change my route and told him about this weird and crazy guy. Luckily, I was able to change with a coworker. I wouldn't have to go to that guy's house anymore. Several weeks later, I asked the coworker who took that part of my route about what was going on. I asked if he noticed the guy staring or anything strange, but he told me that nothing weird had happened since he started doing it. I was glad that the guy had stopped doing that, but I also found that quite strange. It made me wonder if this behavior was targeted at me specifically. Looking back, I still don't know what the guy was doing. Why he was staring at me or blocked me in his backyard, I don't know at all. I get the creeps just thinking back to it. This happened when I lived in a 2-story apartment. It was about a 30-year-old building. It was in a great location right by the train station, and the rent was cheaper than all the other buildings in town. Naturally, the living conditions were poor, and the other residents weren't exactly high society. There was an old man who seemed to spend every waking moment coughing or clearing his throat as loud as possible. There was also a foreign couple who would fight during all hours of the night in their own language, which I didn't even understand. As for me, back then I was young, and I was only working part-time. I didn't have that much of an income. At some point, something strange started happening. It wasn't that big to begin with. I remember thinking one day, I'm sure I didn't take out the garbage, but the bin was mysteriously empty. Seriously, was someone stealing my garbage for some reason? I asked myself. I realized how dumb that sounded, so I put it to the back of my mind. When it happened again, I was a little concerned to say the least. Who was coming and rummaging through my garbage? Why would someone even do that? It was weird, but not that much of an inconvenience. It only started to get really spooky when some of my underwear went missing. Then, a couple of days later, I woke up to find the dirty dishes in my sink had all been washed. I definitely did not remember doing that. It was extremely weird. I began to question my own power of recollection. One day, I came home from work a little earlier than usual because I wasn't feeling all too well. I unlocked my door, and that's when I caught my first sight of her. There was a woman I'd never seen before, sat at my kitchen table and licking a pair of my chopsticks. I was so shocked I immediately left without saying a word. One of my neighbors called the police for me, and they arrived pretty quickly. I explained what happened, and they went to investigate. While I waited outside, I heard a woman scream in there. After a few moments, she was brought out. They were clearly placing her under arrest. The next day, the police called me to let me know what was going on. The woman they had arrested was one of my next-door neighbors. She lived all alone, and I was told she was suffering from some sort of mental illness. She was in the hospital now, getting some treatment. Because the apartment block was so old, she'd managed to dig a way into my apartment through the adjoining wall. She would stand on her wardrobe and push a panel aside, then climb through the hole into my apartment. She told the police the reason she'd done this was because she was obsessed with me and wanted to have me all to herself. I found this quite hard to believe, since that was the first time I'd ever laid eyes on her. She had long dark hair and was so skinny. The officer told me it would be best if I moved, since they couldn't arrest her on account of her mental disorder. It did worry me that one day she might come back. Luckily, a friend let me stay with him for a while. I went back to my apartment to quickly box up some of my belongings. It was about a half a year later. I was finally getting around to sorting out some of my old stuff from inside those boxes I'd packed up. I came across my old photo album. I flipped through it for nostalgia's sake and felt a chill run up my spine. I found out that my creepy neighbor had cut all of the women out of these photos and put her own photos in their place. One was a photo of me with my arm wrapped around my sister. My creepy neighbor is still out there somewhere, but I hope we never have to meet again. This happened when I was a university student. I rented an apartment and lived all alone back then. I'm not the kind of guy who believes in ghosts or supernatural experiences, but something at night would always wake me up. I would hear this really odd sound. It wasn't something I could blame on electricity or street noise outside. I thought it was definitely coming from inside the room. I got really freaked out every time I heard it, but I'd only ever hear it once at a time. It kind of went to the back of my mind for about a week or so, until I began to hear it again. This time, I didn't hear it in the dead of night though. It was only about 9 o'clock or so. I was already in bed and wasn't feeling that great. That was when I began to realize that the source of this mysterious sound seemed to be coming from out on the balcony. It wasn't exactly the same sound I was familiar with, but it certainly was similar. I looked over to the balcony area, only to see a figure standing outside, just behind the curtains. Due to how odd the sound was, I initially thought this might be a ghost or something. I was too terrified to move. I then began to hear what sounded as if someone was punching on the window with all their might. I looked over against my balcony window. The shadow was hammering on my window with a knife in its hand. I feared for my life. I jumped out of bed and ran barefoot as fast as I could. I ran over and frantically banged on the owner of the building's door. I explained to him what happened, and he called the police for me. 2 officers arrived, and the landlord and I accompanied them back to the room. The police tried to quietly open the door, but to their surprise and mine, they found that it was locked. They asked me if I had locked it before I'd left, and of course I didn't. I didn't even bring shoes with me. That's how scared I was. One of the officers seemed to take issue with this and fixed me a glare. "Did you really see something there? Because someone must have locked this door." "Of course I did," I replied. I was still in panic mode, and the cop was not exactly helping me to calm down. It really annoyed me that he didn't seem to believe me. The landlord came back from his room with the master key in hand. We watched with bated breath as he unlocked the door. As the door swung open, immediately a crazed-looking woman sprinted out of my room brandishing a kitchen knife. I recognized her. It was my neighbor. "Don't come in here. I'm gonna kill you." She began to utter phrases and random words which made no sense. When the police tried to approach and calm her down, she rushed back over to the balcony and clambered over it. She seemed to disappear almost instantly. I thought in that moment that she must have fallen. I lived on the 2nd floor, by the way. I heard a dull thud. We all hurried to the balcony and looked down. She had jumped down and gotten the knife stuck in her thigh. She was writhing in pain, or perhaps it was anger. That was by far the scariest thing that ever happened to me. If I hadn't run to the landlord's apartment, I don't know if I'd still be alive today. I later heard from the landlord that the noise I'd heard in my apartment before that fateful night was probably coming from her room. It was right on the opposite side of mine. They'd found slashes in the wall facing my room. I still don't know why she did all of this, but I'm happy to hear she's getting some help. Hopefully, she won't be a danger to anyone out there once she gets it. In the 3 months I had lived next door to her, we had only ever exchanged greetings to each other in passing, and I knew nothing about her at all. 3 months ago, I was a normal person, and so was she. So be careful out there. Don't forget to ask yourself every now and then, how well do you really know your neighbors?